Welcome. Hello. My name's Kyle Gamache. I'm one of the adjunct professors here in the psychology department. I've been asked by the Psych Club to come and talk about a topic that's really important to forensic psychology, and that's this phenomenon of false confessions. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me because I love forensic psych. This is my stuff, and this is what I like talking about, so I'm excited to be here. So when we say false confession, what we're talking about, just to make it clear, is we're talking about people that have not committed a crime but confess to it anyway. And it's a contradictory behavior, but it happens, and it's incredibly damaging to our society. So that's why it's really, really important that we study this and we talk about it. It's a huge, huge topic, and we don't have a ton of time, so we're going to do some brief overview, and I want to save some time for questions. If we could please just keep any questions till the end, and then we can get right into it. And hopefully we can start this, and if anybody else is interested, we have the bibliography. I'm happy to talk any more outside of here too about it. Okay? So I just want to give a famous example, and some people probably already heard about this case, and if not, well, we're going to talk about it now. It's the Central Park 5 or the Central Park jogger case. And very brief overview is that it was April 18th, 1989. There was a period of civil unrest in Central Park in New York City. And there was vandalism and misdemeanor offenses committed by two dozen different teenagers. During this period of time, unfortunately, a young woman that was jogging through the park was assaulted. She was brutally assaulted, almost killed, and she was raped. Her name was Tricia. She suffered extensive injuries. She almost did not survive. When she came out of a coma several days later, she had no memory of what had taken place. The city was very galvanized by this. They were very upset. People started to investigate this crime. The police eventually arrested 5 juveniles for the crime. These juveniles were investigated by the police and interrogated with their parents present if needed, but New York had a law at the time that if you were over 16, you didn't need your parents there. So they were interrogated for up to 30 hours, and they were presented with evidence that said that they had fingerprints of them on the victim, and they had hair samples of them on the victim. After being presented with this evidence, 4 of the 5 youths confessed to the crime. And on the strength of that confession, all 5 of them were convicted of first-degree sexual assault, attempted murder, aggravated assault, and they spent many years in prison. Some 13 years later, another man who was in prison on a life sentence for serial rape and attempted murder confessed to the crime, said that he acted alone, and DNA evidence linked him and him alone to this assault. These boys were released from prison, albeit some 13 years later, and they were all exonerated. So why did these 5 kids confess to a hideous crime that they did not commit? And that's what we're here to talk about today, is why this happens. Okay? So if you don't know about the Innocent Project, it's a very fascinating organization, and I strongly advise people to learn about it or get involved if you can. The Innocent Project, what they do is they take people that have been convicted for crimes that we suspect they did not commit and work to get them exonerated. As of this morning, over 300 people have been exonerated because of DNA evidence. And often these are people that are on death row. There are several death row cases. There are several cases of people in life imprisonment for crimes that they simply did not commit. And DNA evidence has been used to free them. So this is a pretty serious thing, and we could spend all day talking about the Innocence Project. But what we're concerned with is 1/3 of these people that DNA evidence has proved that they did not commit the crime confess to it. This is a contradictory thing, right? And this is just the over 100 people that the Innocence Project has proven confessed to crimes they didn't commit. This issue might be much, much larger. We suspect that these 100 people are just the tip of the iceberg, and there are many people that confess to crimes they didn't commit for a number of reasons and then are punished because of it. So just to kind of go over this, our justice system is really based on this idea that innocence must be protected much more significantly than guilt be punished. Both of these quotes are significant. The bottom one is from Justice Blackstone, who is an English magistrate. He formulated this idea in the 17th century that said, it's better to let guilty people go free than punish innocent people. And the entire English Penal Code is based on this. The English Penal Code is the foundation of our justice system. So this is a common thing. John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, everybody's believing this, that it's better to protect innocent people than punish guilty people. So it's better to let 10, 20, 100 guilty people go free than punish one innocent. And that's America, that's justice, that's who we are. Just to put this into perspective, these men disagreed with that concept. And if you don't know who these people are, just take my word that they're bad people. It's the mass murderers, dictators that believe that innocence is arbitrary. Okay, so we want to be on this side, not this side, right? So every time that this happens, where innocent people are punished, it is a travesty, it is a miscarriage of justice. To quote Dr. King, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So even if this only took place and affected 100 people, it could affect any of us. And we strongly suspect that it's affected many, many more people than 100. Okay? The truth is, people do confess to crimes they didn't commit for a number of reasons. People make mistakes, people are lied to, and they are confused, and they confess to things to stop an interrogation, to avoid punishment, and that in turn gets them in trouble. Okay? Confession evidence is so powerful, it controls investigations. It corrupts any other kind of evidence. So it trumps everything. Even if there are cases where people have had eyewitness evidence that says they weren't involved in a crime, if they confess to it, usually that's what juries listen to, even when instructed not to. An even further confusing and upsetting element of this is that it is radically disproportionate. The mentally ill are targeted for these kind of interrogations and are more likely to confess to crimes. Vulnerable populations, people that are juveniles, are much more likely to confess to crimes they didn't commit, but then get punished as adults. It's not just these vulnerable populations, though. Quote unquote, normal, regular people confess to these kind of things. So why does this happen? Well, here's the deal. Within this, we have some protections within the Fifth Amendment, which is, you plead the Fifth. The Fifth Amendment lets us not give witness against ourselves. Okay, so it's a fundamental right. However, until very recently, the police could utilize methods to rob you of that right. Until the mid-1930s, police could assault you, torture you, waterboard you, to get you to confess to something. Until the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that, that's against the rules. But they could continue to interrogate you for days, not let you talk to your family, not give you food or water, days on end. In these kind of environments, of course, they're going to break people down. The Supreme Court has slowly removed these abilities to take away the Fifth Amendment. The most famous one is Miranda. Everybody kind of knows about your Miranda rights. It's on all the cop shows. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in the court of law, this kind of stuff. Everybody that watches Law & Order should kind of be able to say that, right? So that's it, right? So we know our rights. Nobody would ever confess to stuff. Well, there's some important things about Miranda that you need to know. Is one, Miranda only protects people that are under arrest. So that's why they start with, you are under arrest. If a police officer walked in right now and said, hey guys, I just want to ask you a few questions, they don't have to tell us that we're all suspect of something. They only have to say that if you're under arrest. They also only have to say that if they're specifically going to ask you questions. So if Isabel and I are talking about committing crimes and a police officer is over here listening, that can be used against us. It only matters if a police officer actually says something to you, specifically. And if you decide, I don't want to talk to the police, whether you're under arrest or not, you have to specifically tell them that you don't want to talk. You have to tell them that I need a lawyer, I want a lawyer. They don't just give you one. So there's some elements with Miranda that don't protect the people that need it the most. I put this down here, right here. If you're ever interacting with the police, and I support the police, I'm not trying to get the police in trouble. If you're talking to the police and you're uncomfortable, you should ask them this: am I free to go? If they say no, you know you're under arrest. And your follow-up question needs to be, I need a lawyer. And that's it, okay? If they tell you you're free to go and you want to go, go. But this is how people get in trouble. And it comes under this belief, is that if I'm innocent, I have nothing to hide. It's okay, I can talk to the police. And again, I can't stress this enough. My parents are police officers. I love the police. I'm not saying anything bad, but their job is to investigate crimes. And we're going to talk about how sometimes that's a problem. But here's the deal. Miranda only protects you if it's properly utilized. If you waive your Miranda rights, it can't protect you. Innocent people, people that have not committed any crime, are much more likely to waive their rights. And the reason for this is they say, well, I have nothing to hide. Or, hey, if I ask for a lawyer, it makes me look guilty. And unfortunately, police are totally okay with you believing that. And say, oh, why do you need a lawyer? We're just talking, okay? So the issue here is people that are innocent are more likely to not ask for a lawyer, are more likely to talk to the police in general and just say, yeah, I want to talk to them. And they're less likely to realize that they're actually suspects and not witnesses. And that's a real big distinction, right? So the big thing here is what has happened in these false confession cases when interviewed later is like, why did you confess to this? Well, often people were confused, they were afraid. And they had this belief that, you know what, it doesn't matter, in the end, everything's going to be okay. In the end, the truth will prevail. In the end, they're going to figure stuff out. CSI Miami is going to come in and figure out that I wasn't there and all this other stuff. I'm really here to tell you, very unfortunately, that is not the case. More times than not, it is absolutely not the case. Another big vulnerable population here are juveniles. So that's anybody under 18, right? So if you're 17 and a half, you're a juvenile in many places. If you're 18, you're not. Is there a real big difference between late 17-year-old and an 18-year-old? No. But in the eyes of the law, there are, okay? But here's a problem. Even juveniles that have their parents with them, listen, we're brought up from a young age, trust the police, right? Talk to the police, listen to the police, do what they tell you to do. You have people that do talk to the police when they shouldn't be, or they say things that they shouldn't. And another big problem here is parents encourage their children to cooperate with the police. Parents sometimes act as legal counsel to their kids, which, unless they're lawyers, is a mistake. Not trying to be grim, but the truth is that sometimes innocent people are much more at risk of this simply because they're innocent, because there's some naivete about the risks involved. Okay? So we don't have a lot of time to go into this. This we could spend a semester talking about. But what I want you to take from this is that there is a technique called the Reid Technique. They make fun of it on TV and have for 50 years about the good cop, bad cop stuff. That's legit. There is a technique that most police departments will utilize to investigate a crime by talking to somebody, to break them down so that they will confess to a crime. We're going to talk a little bit about it. It is pretty good at getting guilty people to eventually confess. It's also pretty good at getting innocent people to confess to things. So what you need to know about interrogations is they're interrogations. They're adversarial in nature. Police will say things to suspects like, hey, we're just trying to get to the bottom of something. We just want to clear something up. While that's true, the truth is that they are investigating a crime. And sometimes people don't realize that. People will think that the police are our friends in an interrogation room. So it makes them much more cooperative. Here's another important point about interrogations, and this is the Reid Technique 101. Police only investigate people that they think are guilty or are lying. So now they'll talk to witnesses, they'll talk to victims. Those are totally different kind of interactions. But when they bring somebody into the back room of the police department under the hot light to talk, they're not talking to them like they're witnesses. And that's something that people don't often, in this situation, don't realize this until it's way too late. The vast majority of these kind of interactions, there's no lawyer present. And there's a reason for that. The reason for that, as quoted by Justice Jackson of the Supreme Court in the 1950s, was no lawyer would ever let their client talk to the police without the lawyer being there. So these kind of interrogations, there's no lawyer there. There's no lawyer saying you shouldn't say anything, you should stop, we should go home, people are on their own. Okay? And now we can get to some more scary stuff about a police interrogation. They utilize three main techniques: isolation, confrontation, and minimization. Isolation, police aren't going to talk to you in your home if they think you're a suspect. They're going to talk to you in the police station, a place you can't leave, in a back room, under hot lights, with just like the desk and a chair, like in the movies. They're isolating people from friends, family, the internet. They don't let them have their phone. So people are confused, they're on their own. It's highly confrontational. The bad cop stuff in TV, it's dramatized, but it's true, is that police start by screaming and yelling in your face and saying, I know you did it. Tell me why you did it. It's very confrontational. It's disruptive. It's upsetting. It's frightening. I hope nobody's had a bad experience with the police. If you haven't, please trust me when I tell you that police are very frightening when they think you've done something wrong. And it breaks people down. And finally, the good cop stuff is true. Police, after this confrontation, will minimize the interaction. They'll say, yeah, hey, I'd be mad at her too. I guess it wasn't that big a deal. I understand. They do things to lull people into this sense that everything is going to be okay when it's not. So those are the main techniques of the Reid Technique. But these last two are very, very important and utilized in most police interrogations. Police can lie. They're allowed to lie. Police can tell you, hey, I have your DNA on the crime. It's all over the place. We know you did it. I have your fingerprints. I have hair samples. I have 3 witnesses that said they saw you walking out of his apartment. They can lie about that. They don't have to prove it. They can just tell you that. And so when faced with that, that's horrifying, right? That's terrifying. Whether you committed the crime or not, it's scary. Police can also make bargains. They can tell you, hey, if you confess to this, you'll get probation. If you don't know much, if you don't know anything about how the government works, police are part of which branch of the government? Executive branch, right? They don't do anything. They're not connected to the judicial branch, which is the one that decides that kind of stuff. So police, for the most part, they can say stuff like that, but it has no weight. When you're in this kind of situation, this is highly coercive. It can change people's idea on what's going on. And the truth is, when faced with these things, it's terrifying. It's confusing. People that are experiencing a police interrogation, particularly one that they're told, hey, I have your DNA. I know it was you. And with CSI and all this stuff, people will say, I'm in trouble. What do I do? Well, I'm going to listen to the police. So you can kind of see how this is getting set up here. Here's another big problem. Like I said, police are only going to interrogate people that are suspected of a crime, right? So they think you've done something wrong. That might be based on a hunch. It doesn't have to be based. There's no rules on that. They can interrogate anybody they want. Interrogations continue often because they think you're lying. And based on this Reid technique, there are some very specific behaviors that they're looking for, like nail biting, sweating, poor eye contact, fidgeting, putting your face in your hands, being upset. All of those things mean you're lying, right? They do, in a sense, but it also probably means that you're under stress, you're afraid, you're scared. And police cannot tell the difference. And I don't mean to beat up on police. None of us can tell the difference. And we'll talk about why. The Reid Technique, in their books, they say, oh yeah, 80% accuracy. I can tell you within 80% whether you're lying or not. No independent research anywhere has ever confirmed that. And this is a big topic in forensic psychology about lie detection. And here's the truth. We are terrible at telling whether somebody is lying to us. All the research is saying it's roughly between 50 and 53%, which if you don't know probability, that means, are you lying to me? Flip a coin, heads, you're lying. It's chance. It doesn't mean anything, okay? Police are no better than regular people. Maybe a little. Police might be 55%, which is not statistically different. So police are no better at telling whether you're lying than I am, and I'm terrible at it. But the strength of this is how police move forward in their investigations. So this sets up a pretty bad situation, right? When you're in the interrogation room. And then when you think about it, here's another thing. This is why we're here, right? We're here to talk about this because this is a question we have. Why would anyone confess it? You would never confess to something you didn't do. Ever. Why would you ever do that? Well, the truth is, that's not the case. People do confess to things that they didn't do. And some of this is because of the interrogation itself. So just think about it. The thought of it makes me really, really scared, right? But think about being interrogated by the police. You're isolated, you're in a room, you haven't been able to talk to anybody, you don't know enough to ask for a lawyer, or you're afraid of it because if I ask for a lawyer, they're going to think I did this. All right, I'll talk to them. So you're isolated, they come in, they literally slam the book down, it's loud and scary, and they start screaming and swearing at you and saying, you're a bad person, you're going to prison, I know you did this, confess. It's terrifying, right? It's bewildering, it confuses people. It makes them feel hopeless, isolated, worn down. And then after hours of this, after you've probably cried your eyes out, maybe vomited because you're so stressed out and so frightening, cop puts his hand or her hand on your shoulder and says, hey, look, let's work this together. I can help you out. What are you going to do? I know exactly what I would do. If I got to this point, I would tell them anything they wanted to know so that this would end. And police they're capitalizing on that. They'll tell you things like, if you confess to this, we'll let you go. Right? So this is really bad. The really bad situation is very manipulative. There's a lot of evidence to show that when the police use the next stuff, when they tell you that they have evidence that you committed a crime, if you committed the crime, what do you think happens? You're filled with despair and, oh, they got me, this is awful, I don't want to go to prison. Horrible feelings, right? Imagine if you didn't commit the crime, but the police tell you that we can prove you did. There's evidence to show that people are filled with despair, hopelessness. They have no idea, they're confused, they're upset, they don't know what to do, and they just want everything to be okay. And if you remember from general psychology, if you took general psychology, there's some elements of human nature that really come into play here. With Milgram, with the switches, when Milgram was getting people to deliver what they thought were lethal shocks just because they were being told to do it. And Osk's conformity study, where people were convinced to give the wrong answer just because everybody else was doing it. Unfortunately, we are very receptive to obedience and authority, particularly in situations where we're terrified. And this, unfortunately, leads to people making confessions confessing to things they didn't commit. So Saul Kassin, if you look at the bibliography, he's written like 50, 60 books on this kind of stuff. He has summarized 3 different kinds of false confessions, okay? The voluntary, the compliant, and the internalized. And we're going to talk about those. It's really the last two, compliant and internalized, that cause the most damage, are the most frightening, and really need to pay attention to. But just to talk voluntary false confessions, this is where somebody voluntarily confesses to the police. Goes into the police station in like several crime movies and says, I did it. I'm the one that did it. Well, sometimes people actually confess to crimes that way. And they actually committed the crimes. And they're overcome with guilt and they say this kind of stuff. That's not what we're concerned with. What we're concerned with when people do that and they didn't commit the crime. Almost every famous crime that has ever taken place, if you ask any police officer that's investigating a major crime, they'll tell you, oh yeah, we get people every day say they did it. It happens. These three cases down here, they're just some famous examples. The one on the left, that's Charles Lindbergh. His son was kidnapped and murdered. Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia, she was brutally murdered in LA in the 40s. John Benet Ramsey was murdered in the mid-90s, late 90s. Multiple people. In John Benet's case, multiple people. In the other two, hundreds of people confessed to the crimes. Logic dictates not all of them could have committed the crime, right? In fact, in Charles Lindbergh's case, 200, 300 people confessed to the murder of his son. None of them were the person that was actually convicted of it. Why does this happen? Mental illness. People have personality traits that make them want to be punished, or they're overcome with guilt. They become obsessed with a crime. They want fame, infamy, the classic deathbed confession. You've lived kind of a boring life. You want to give a dramatic exit. It happens all the time. So this is a weird phenomenon, and it's important. It's not the one that we're most concerned with, okay? The one that we are, one of them is the compliant false confession. So this is the kind of the classic thing. The Central Park jogger was one of those cases, is you have people that confess to crimes because they are afraid of punishment, or they are intimidated by the police and they want the interrogation to end. They're confused and they're told, if you confess to this, you won't see the inside of a jail, which, by the way, you always see the inside of a jail. But they're trying to comply. They're trying to work with the police so that they don't get in trouble. And they confess to something and then they're in a lot of trouble. Normal people do this. Like, I don't want you to think that it's only the mentally ill or juveniles or vulnerable population. Normal people do this. However, there are certain populations that are at a much higher risk of doing this. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. I have this picture down here just to kind of illustrate this. This man, his name was Early Washington, or is Early Washington. He was convicted of a rape and murder of a local woman in his town. He was brought in by the police. He was interrogated for, I thought it was 40 hours, okay, and told that there was evidence against him. He confessed to this crime. Mr. Washington has an IQ of 69. Vulnerable population, people with intellectual dysfunction are much higher rates of being compliant with authority and saying yes to things and not fully comprehending their rights. Mr. Washington was sentenced to death. He spent several years on death row. His sentence was luckily commuted to life imprisonment. He spent 17 years in prison before DNA evidence exonerated him. So he never committed the crime, but he spent half his life in prison. Almost was killed by the government because of this confession. That is a compliant false confession. Okay? Even scarier, there are internalized false confessions. This happens when the people start to believe they actually committed the crime, even though they didn't. Classically, this happens when somebody is given evidence that, hey, I have your DNA. You did this, right? And they go, I guess I did. DNA could never be wrong. CSI tells me it's always, and they know right away. No. So this includes the mentally ill, juveniles, but normal people do this all the time, okay? These two cases here, the man on the kid on the left, he's a man now, but he was 14 at the time. His name's Michael Crow. He was arrested for and confessed to the brutal murder of his 14-year-old sister. He did this because the police said, hey, Mike, we have your sister's blood all over your shoes. So you killed her, right? And he said, I don't remember killing her, but I must have. I must have done it. I don't know how. So he was almost convicted on that. And then the police actually found the guy that actually had his sister's blood on his clothes and arrested that guy. But so this kid confessed to killing his own sister, and he didn't do it. The gentleman on the right is Ryan Ferguson. This is an even weirder and sadder case. Mr. Ferguson was out, he was 17, and he was out drinking with one of his friends, and they became so drunk they blacked out. During this period of time, in town, somebody was murdered. His friend became obsessed with the crime and said, I was in town that night, I don't remember what happened, did I have anything to do with it? And eventually convinced himself he did. And under police interrogation, his friend said, yep, I don't remember doing it, but I must have done it. And Ryan was with me the whole time, so Ryan must have done it too. So Ryan was, they were both convicted, and they both have served a lot of time. Ryan has been exonerated. His friend is still in prison. And his friend, if Ryan didn't do it, his friend couldn't possibly have done it because they were both passed out in a gutter somewhere. But his friend is still in prison. Ryan is trying to free him, but in any case, that's an example of an internalized false confession. So these things happen, and it's really frightening. So how does it keep happening? Well, it keeps happening because of this too. This belief that, listen, I know false confessions happen, but if I saw one, if one of my suspects said this, I would know. Well, as we kind of know, that's not true, right? The problem is every police, juries, judges, they all think, yeah, I know a real confession between a false confession. We've already talked about lie detecting, right? And nobody's good at that. We are all subject to the fundamental attribution error. Which, if you remember from social psych, and if you don't, I'll tell you, is that we are more likely to judge other people for internal things. So if you do something wrong, I'm more likely to say, oh yeah, you're a bad person. If I do something wrong, oh no, it's this, that, and the other thing. It's all these external things. We all make that error. So people say, well, the only reason you would confess to something isn't because the police didn't let you talk to a lawyer. It's because the police, it's because you actually did it, sorry. So that's the error, right? Also, we talked about the lie detection where none of us are good at it. Well, research shows that not only are we not good at it, police are not good at it, and also police are very confident that they're good at it. So police are very like, not only do I know you're lying, I know you really did it. Whereas, well, they might be lying, I don't know. Like that's the difference between regular people and the police, is the police are very, very confident. And the problem is, this leads to interrogations. This leads to people putting pressure. There's this concept about leaked information. It's like, well, he knew what color her hair was. He knew what kind of car they had, so he must have done it. Well, unfortunately, police, by accident, sometimes give that information to the person. Maybe hours before the interrogation starts, I'm talking about, I'm a cop, I'm talking about it with my partner, suspect overhears it. That's leaked information, but when I ask him or her about it, it looks like they knew, and the only way they could know is if they were there, and now I put all this pressure on them and they break down. Also, a little thing about confession, in case you don't know it, when you confess to something, you have to write out a statement, okay? So if you make mistakes in that statement, the police review and say, oh no, you don't mean this, right? You meant something else. And because you're complying, you change your confession. The confession that goes to court looks perfect. Like, oh yeah, I knew everything about the case. You knew everything about the case because first they told you, second they made sure that it looked like it. So that's how this stuff happens. And then when it gets to trial, like we mentioned already, confessions are incredibly damaging, okay? He confessed, he must be guilty. There's no other way, there's no other reason. The fundamental attribution error, right? So police, when they get a confession, usually stop investigating the crime. Say, oh, we got our man or our woman. Or if they continue to investigate, they're looking for evidence to simply support the confession. Nothing else. Now, I'm not saying 100%, 90%, that's how it goes, okay? Juries, Juries are made up of regular people like us, for the most part. Juries are terrible at looking at other evidence once a confession's been entered in. They say, oh, he's guilty. He must have done it. He confessed. And this happens all the time. Juries will ignore all other kinds of evidence, often. And if the confession is admitted into court, the conviction rate goes up 70, 80%. Okay? And even following an exoneration, the justice system sometimes still says, there's a problem here. He did it. He confessed. He did it. And that's this case down here. There's a real sad case. This gentleman, his name's Bruce. He was convicted of raping 2 women, and he spent 12 years in prison. DNA evidence was introduced by the Innocence Project to say that he was not involved in this at all. The district attorney said, those results must be flawed. So they had to get another round of testing. And the district attorney said, listen, and this is a direct quote, I have no scientific basis for this, but I know that he did it because I trust my detectives and I trust that confession. He refused to let him go. They had to get a federal court case involved before he was finally exonerated. And that is not an isolated incident. There's tons of, if you ever look up any of these exonerations, check to see what the prosecutor says. Many times they're saying stuff like, I know we just let a guilty man go free. Well, first of all, that's probably not true. But second, even if it is, remember what we talked about at the start. It's better to let possible guilty people go free than punish somebody that's innocent. So, vulnerable populations. So again, normal people can do this. But here's the thing. People that are intoxicated confess to stuff all the time. People that are detoxing or withdrawing from drugs, because keep in mind, they can lock you in a room for hours and hours and hours and hours. They confess to crimes. The mentally ill, depressed, anxious, people that are filled with guilt or suicidal, confess to crimes. The intellectually dysfunction, low IQs, people with Down syndrome, youth, juveniles, confess to crimes all the time. These are vulnerable populations. There are people that are more prone to being compliant with authority. There are people that are very susceptible to coercion. So, I mean, how do we fix this? Well, there's some research to show there are a couple of ways we could fix this, and Casson talks about it. One of the big ones is you have to videotape interrogation so you can fully see what happened. To their credit, many police departments are videotaping all interrogations, but there are some that aren't. Or they'll only videotape the confession and not the 5, 6, 12 hours that led up to it. Casson says if we start videotaping everything start to finish, we'll be able to tease out if there was malicious interrogation or if there was coercion or manipulation. Expert witnesses like Casson, like other folks, testifying in court, very important. Proper jury instructions, telling them about what's going on. Education to judges, prosecutors, police could help this. So, in summary, guys, I want you to take this, is that innocent people are targeted for interrogation and sometimes will confess to crimes they didn't commit, and sometimes that's based solely on the interrogation techniques of the police or their mental status, okay? Once that confession goes in, it is incredibly hard to get out, and it will affect juries, it will affect everything. So confessions, really bad evidence and are highly damaging. So if they're given, we want to make sure they're given by people that are guilty as opposed to people that were coerced into it.
So thank
Sounds
you so
good.
much.
Yeah. Thanks, guys.